来自何方？我们是谁？将去向何处？在艺术家保罗·高更这幅画的左上方，隐藏着3个以法文写下的问题：我们来自何方？我们是谁？将去向何处？和多数人一样，长久以来，我对人类存在本质感到疑惑。身为纪录片导演，我有机会从不同角度来探索这些深奥的谜题。而我日益发现，对我帮助最大、最具挑战性的，往往来自于奥地利哲学家鲁道夫·史代纳的著作。本部片的主题为史代纳的生平。史代纳的理念和洞察启发了人类生活的方方面面，让人省思人类的真实本性。用高更的话来说，就是我们是谁。史代纳可能会进一步问，我们将会成为什么
？Rudolf Steiner challenges us to be more conscious, and also, I think, to ground our consciousness in the warmth of heart. And I feel one of the most important things about Steiner is actually that he encourages us to bring thinking and feeling together, so head and heart together.
For me, meeting the work of Rudolf Steiner was like finding water in the desert, because I had searched and searched through many different spiritual paths, very much in the East and also in the West, including the spiritual path of modern science.
I can't think of anybody else who simultaneously follows the whole philosophical and scientific tradition within the West and within modernity, studies it carefully, it becomes very competent in its different disciplines, and at the same time is clearly a mystic.
I think the challenge for me is to individualize what he has given. As he was in Norway, he almost always in his talks said, "Don't believe what I'm saying. You have to try it in life. Try it in life." And for me, that's my inner direction. I have to try it out and not just take it for granted it is like this. And then life becomes so exciting.
I think really Steiner is about love. But it's hard to get to that realization because of so many thoughts. So many thoughts. But when I think of him, I don't always think of the thoughts, though I'm impressed by them, of course. I think much more of this man, traveling on drafty trains in the middle of the night to go to the next city to meet with, 9 people who are trying to figure something out, or people just scratching at him constantly for help. So he was a servant. So he wasn't a privileged person, he was a servant. So I think it's about love, really.
史代纳的影响日趋明显，特别是在教育、农业及医药领域。华德福学校在印度有7所，全球共1000家以上。此外，还有为学习障碍者建立的社区，以及数以千计的农夫采用史代纳建议的农耕法，不仅生产更健康的食材，更在耕作过程中疗愈土地。华德福学校生物动力农业 韦雷德、德米特、德国世家、康复村等名字在全球越来越广为人知。我拜访了印度南方一群经营小型农场的农夫，学习太阳、月亮和行星如何影响植物生长。这提醒我们，这种古老的耕作方式在世界上许多地方尚未被完全遗忘。1924年，史代纳去世前一年，他对中欧农夫发表一系列演说，分享这些部分基于传统智慧的农耕知识，了解星象运行对作物种类与播种时间产生的影响，也是生物动力农业的核心。当时的农人对化学肥料表示担忧，认为肥料对土地和农作物的健康与质量产生了不良影响。这一系列演说适时地提供了信息和启发，使生物动力农业成为全球运动。
The beauty of Dr. Rudolf Steiner is that he was not just a philosopher living in a world of ideas and just philosophizing and just thinking. He brought all these ideas to practical human activity, whether it's agriculture, education, medicine, architecture.
史代纳成长于铁道旁，他的父亲是铁路站长，因此他的四周总是环绕着令人兴奋的铁路新世界。1863年，史代纳2岁时，他的父亲转调至下奥地利州波特恰克，史代纳在那里住到8岁。他在自传中深深赞赏他成长环境中的自然景色。尽管新科技近在咫尺，他的生活十分单纯，然而却并非平顺安逸。在这里，史代纳生活在他热爱的铁路和自然2个世界里。然而他内心已感受到一个和外在物质世界一样真实的灵性世界。年仅7岁时，他亲历一个刚刚自杀的亲属前来找他帮忙。然而，过了近40年后，史代纳才公开谈论这种话题。现实的真正本质是什么？我们来自何方？我们是谁？将去向何处？这些将是史代纳穷其一生思考的问题。1868年，史代纳一家人搬到维也纳附近的新德弗尔。这时他多了一个弟弟和一个妹妹。这个村庄虽不像波特恰克那样偏远，但据史代纳形容，他的家庭生活依然简朴而健康。他在当地天主教教堂担任辅祭，帮家人种菜。他在童年和青少年徒步远足上学，这段旅程的基调表示他是一个聪明却孤独的孩子。在父亲督促下学习科学和科技，准备成为铁路工程师。但他也深入思考他称为存在之谜的问题。才14岁，便已研读了德国哲学家伊曼努尔·康德的著作。1879年，他18岁，以特优成绩通过毕业考试。在那3年里，他为同学担任私人家教赚取收入。他写道：“多少为收入微薄的父母分担些学费。”由于他就读专科学校而非文法学校，他必须自学拉丁文和希腊文。对平凡的铁路站长之子史代纳而言，从奥地利乡村搬到维也纳是很大的转变。维也纳是幅员广大的哈布斯堡帝国的首都，也是一个生气蓬勃、 充满丰沛的创作力和哲学辩论，文化百花齐放的大都会。同年秋季，史黛纳入读科技大学，修习生物、化学、物理和数学。但他对德国哲学与文学的热衷程度并不亚于科学。他的社交圈迅速拓展。史黛纳当年曾使用知名的格林斯德咖啡馆为地址，现在该咖啡馆已成为观光景点，不复见昔日的哲学辩论盛景。但在转角的这家咖啡店，不难想象当年的时代氛围。青年史黛纳在咖啡馆结识了形形色色的人，包括诗人、富商、西多会修士、女性主义者、大学教授及和他一样的穷学生。我访问2位对史黛纳的生平和思想略有涉猎的年轻顾客，问他们这样的咖啡馆以及史黛纳和其他人的对谈讨论是不是已一去不复返。
Those dialogues really to sit hours and hours, yeah, and to develop an idea. I think you can't find that in that way anymore.
Do you think that's sad?
In a way, yes, because I'm old-fashioned. But I'm quite open to new ways of dialogues, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think especially the communication through the net is an enormous chance, yeah.
Opportunity, yeah.
Opportunity,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So you're optimistic about the future in that sense, are you?
I'm very optimistic, yeah.
Yeah.
And to me, the idea, it's always a question, how would Steiner act in those days, yeah? Would he use the internet or not? I think he would.
Yes.
Definitely.
Yeah.
He would be very, very open to our ways and our chances and our opportunities to communicate, to develop, to work together.
不是每位对史黛纳思想有兴趣的人都会同意琵琶对史黛纳和互联网的看法，因为他和许多人一样，认识到从印刷术发明以来的科技进步无法取代面对面的人际交流，而且如果我们不能觉知这类设备背后隐藏的思维方式，整个世界可能会逐渐丧失人性。然而，史黛纳明确指出，这些决定最终必须是个人选择。
His main message, especially to me, was or is that he wants us to stand up for our own ideas. And that's, especially in our time, not that easy. So for people, it's much more easy to put him into a box than to focus his message and follow the message. And I think he didn't want us to follow him. He wanted us to follow ourselves.
虽然史黛纳的交友圈越来越广，但他也不忘听从自己内在的声音。然而和所有人相同，他需要唤醒者，那些改变你生命的人。费利克斯·科古斯基正是这样一个人。在定期从家返回维也纳的火车上，史黛纳和草药师费利克斯相遇，后者正带着在乡间采集的药草前往维也纳的药局销售。终于有人能和史黛纳分享他的内在灵性体验。史黛纳在自传中写道，他背上附着成素草药，心中蕴藏着采药过程中体悟到的大自然之灵性面目。费利克斯告诉史黛纳，博大精深的传统智慧即将从中欧民俗文化中彻底消失。 史代纳与这个他口中的古老的灵魂心有灵犀，同样拥有他从小体验到的直觉感知，而史代纳正试着了解这种感知，并巩固它在现代意识世界的位置。此外，史代纳越发重视，在追寻深层智慧的旅途上，我们每迈出一步，就必须在道德发展上迈出3步。约25年后，他写道：一个人踏上学习之旅的目的，不应是为了丰富自己的知识宝库，而是应用于为世界服务。同时，青年史代纳还将邂逅另一位伟大的唤醒者，一个同样对他生命产生巨大影响的人。在德语世界众多过去和现代名人中，50年前去世的大文豪约翰·沃尔夫冈·冯·歌德对史代纳影响最深，不止在诗歌和小说领域，在科学领域，尤其是解剖学、光学和植物学更有深远影响。史代纳日后称他为有机世界的哥白尼和开普勒。
Goethe was a huge influence on Steiner, and Steiner felt that he discovered a kindred spirit in Goethe, because he was approaching the natural world with an open heart, and not as an object to be studied and measured and quantified, but rather as a world that was still imbued with something sacred. I think Goethe was very aware of the sacredness of nature, and that's why he wanted to approach it in a different way, with empathy, rather than with objectifying consciousness.
But he still thought of himself as a scientist, didn't he, Goethe?
He certainly did, because he was interested in knowledge, and in a type of knowledge that was a direct knowing, really a perceiving, to actually see into the spiritual workings of nature. So he was focused much more on the world of qualities than of quantities, and much more on what could be perceived by each person as a human being, unaided by any scientific instruments. So for him, scientific instruments tended to get in the way of really seeing what was living in nature. That's why he's so much at odds with the approach of mainstream science.
作家杰里米·奈德勒是神学与宗教学博士，他定居牛津，以园丁为业。
For Goethe, the human being is the most exact instrument. If you can develop that instrument into an organ of deep perception, then of course you'll see more and more in nature, and that's what Steiner was able to do. He developed himself as a spiritual instrument, I suppose. So he was perceiving much more than most people are able to perceive in the natural world, and he extended that to invisible worlds, of course.
And was pointing to the fact that we all have this potential then.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's not so easy to develop it, though.
No.
But, you know, one just has to keep working at it, really on a daily basis.
What is your understanding of the key to working with it then?
Well, when I go into the gardens, I'm very aware that the first thing I want to do is, you know, I see weeds and, you know, and I see all sorts of things that need doing. So I want to get engaged with practical stuff. But I try to stop myself and just spend at least a few minutes with a plant and just observe it, just be with it. And there's something immensely centering and healing in doing that. And I feel it actually helps the rest of my day in the garden. You realize that there's a miracle there, really. And it's so easy to not see it.
Yeah. But that would be true perhaps of life altogether. We just simply don't notice things, do we? We take things for granted.
Yeah.
Not just plants.
That's absolutely true of life altogether.
Goethe does provide a kind of transition, a foundation for a transition between, I might say, conventional day consciousness and what Steiner calls ultimately his spiritual science. That is to say, a way of engaging the world of spirit, the world of our own inner experiences, with as much surety and clarity as we do the outer world. I'm going to remind you of what we saw at the very beginning of our class. Remember, there was a little Wimshurst machine here that allows us to do something very similar, slightly different geometry, but basically a similar kind of arrangement.
亚瑟·扎恩斯是美国麻省大学阿姆斯特分校的物理学教授。我请他说明年轻时期的史代纳对哲学家伊曼努尔·康德的关注，特别是史代纳对康德深具影响力的知识局限性所提出的反对意见。
The limits, the so-called limits to knowledge, are really the limits of a horizon. You know, if you stand on a mountaintop, you see further than if you're down in the valley. Well, but you got to get to the mountaintop, right? So yes, you could say there are limits to knowledge if you're in a particular location, but there's nothing to keep you from developing yourself to a higher extent. It's like climbing the mountain and seeing further. There'll still be a horizon, so you'll still experience a limit, but the limit is a subjective limit, not an objective statement about the way the world is organized. So yes, you could say Steiner recognized that there are, in the moment, certain limits to knowledge, but that these are not part of our human nature. Human nature is, in some ways, inexhaustible. Everything that can be known by the human being. We are, in that sense, in the image of God. We are filled with the potential for the most profound and extraordinary way of knowing.
I looked at it more carefully and then saw in its leaves it does something incredible. That the lower leaves are long-stalked and kidney-shaped, and they form a little rosette. There are only 3 of them still alive. There were more earlier on. Then a little ways up the main stem, you have the next leaf, which also has a long stalk, but is already in its blade.
克雷格·霍尔德里奇也是史代纳的长期研究者，并经由史代纳成为歌德的研究者。他在纽约上州创立了自然学院，探索史代纳常年实践的静心观察。
We founded the Nature Institute with the intention of having a place that can cultivate a particular way of knowing that can bring us back more in relationship with nature and the things themselves. And now that sounds, very harmless and simple and maybe not even that important, but if you think about how strongly our culture and our minds are captivated with certain kind of abstract ideas, and we notice that people come to us with many, many abstractions in their minds about what hormones do, about what the brain does, about how natural selection has made us this way or that way. And we have all these explanations of the world, but do we see the world? Do we experience the world anymore? And of course, with our technologically dominated culture, this becomes more and more an issue. Goethe said something like, if we want to gain a living understanding of nature, we must make ourselves as mobile and flexible as nature herself. So science as transformation of the human being to understand the living character of the world. That's the mission of the Nature Institute. When Steiner came across Goethe's work when he was still a student at the university in Vienna, What he found in Goethe, what stimulated him in Goethe, was that here was a man who really immersed himself in the phenomenal world, didn't have lots of abstract concepts, and thereby opened himself to seeing relationships that spoke of more than the mere physical. It is just unfortunate today that we are so much in a dualistic culture, you know, matter and mind, soul, or body and spirit, if we even think about the one half, right? But if we do think about the spiritual or the soul or whatever, then it's always in contrast to the body or this, but to see a unified world. And that was really Steiner, in his epistemology based on Goethe, was all about the one world that we live in. It is one world, and we are part of one world. And there aren't 2 or 3 or 50. There might be nuances and different levels, or whatever you want to call them, different aspects that one can gain access to, but it is one manifoldly differentiated world. In this approach to understanding the world, you really do have to slow down. So I've, sometimes thought about, this methodology or this aspect of the methodology, that it would be interesting to speak of, like one speaks of slow food today and slow money, to speak of slow science. We need to slow down so that we can really dwell in the things as a basis of a more, as the basis of a deeper understanding of the world.
Towards each other too, then.
Yes. I mean, in all respects. I speak mainly about, when I'm speaking about nature, I'm also speaking about my fellow human beings, right? In all our relationships, this, taking the time.
这栋建筑物是斯皮赫特家族的住所。在维也纳求学期间，史代纳和该家族关系密切。这段关系日后产生了深远影响。他在维也纳的最后6年，一边担任该家族4个男孩的家庭导师，一边研读并撰述歌德。这些孩子当中，最令父母担忧的是奥托。在所有人眼中，10岁的奥托是一个身心异常的小孩，无法教育。但在史代纳的帮助下，奥托的状况逐渐改善，长大后成为医生。今日，治疗教育运动蔚然成风。比如，像这座位于英格兰塞文河口的特殊教育学校。这类学校和村庄遍布全世界。1924年，史代纳根据他教导奥托的经验，加上对人的构成和各种异常的了解，发表了一系列演讲，从而带动了这个运动的盛行。史代纳下个阶段的挑战是编辑歌德的科学论文，以及书写他的主要著作《自由的哲学》。1891年，30岁的史代纳取得了罗斯托克大学哲学博士学位。前一年，他搬至魏玛，在那里度过了7年的孤独时光。他在歌德和席勒档案馆担任文献编辑，但没有人可以和他讨论他内心日益丰富的灵性体验。此外，他的哲学写作和见解依然未受关注。
I discovered Steiner when I was in my early 20s, and I was at Oxford at the university in a highly intellectualized environment, which I hated, and
Studying
philosophy, well, PPE, which includes philosophy. Philosophy was the thing that I was really interested in, keen on, and it was just agony for me. I hated it. It was Bertrand Russell and David Hume and every manner of reductionist thinker that you could imagine. And there was no real philosophy. And then I came across Steiner's work, and it was a godsend to me, because there was someone talking about thinking, but in a completely different way from the abstract, intellectualized thinking that's practiced in the universities. So,
can you describe what that view is then? I mean, what was this alternative?
Well, one of Steiner's key books is The Philosophy of Spiritual Activity, or The Philosophy of Freedom, has those two different titles. And in that book, he describes how thinking as an activity can be intensified so that it becomes a kind of dialogue with the world of spirit. And that seemed to me to be a path that I could follow.
But when you say world of spirit, I mean, that can sound pretty weird to some people. Are you talking about talking to spiritual beings, or what do you mean by the world of spirit?
Well, yes, I do. It may well sound weird, but I think that's the reality of it, yes. But of course, one's actually in a kind of inner dialogue with a world of thoughts, but the question is, what is the source of our thinking? Where do our thoughts come from? That's a living question, which I think anyone who's engaged with that question of what thinking really is obliged to ask.
I mean, most people would probably say that our thoughts come from our brain.
Most people probably would say that, yes. Well, I don't think that's actually correct. And even to the extent, of course, thinking is dependent on our having a brains. If you cut my head off, I wouldn't be able to think. But it doesn't mean that the source of thinking is material.
我应当沉默多久？史代纳自问。当时他年已40，依然无法分享他所称的 Die geistige Welt 灵性世界。1897年，他搬至柏林，起初担任一本先锋文学与戏剧杂志编辑。但他感兴趣的不只是知识分子和艺术家，他还受邀至劳工教育学院教授历史课程。这份工作他做了7年。但在柏林以及欧洲和其他地区，越来越多的人对源于东方智慧的灵性学感兴趣，比如神智学。终于有听众渴望听人讨论自我的内在世界，不局限于过去。然而，一场最强烈的体验，终将使他与许多早期追随者分道扬镳。神智学认为，耶稣基督只不过是历代众多伟大的导师之一，而对史代纳而言，耶稣基督的入世作为一个具有重大意义的宇宙行动，带给他强大的脱胎换骨的体验。
It's not a sectarian understanding of Christ, so I think he's not wanting to associate Christ too closely with the Christian church. I mean, I think the Christian church, sadly, is all too sectarian sometimes. For Steiner, it's a strong view of how humanity as a whole is transformed by Christ.
弗雷泽瓦茨是英国圣公会牧师，一直对史代纳的思想深感兴趣。他是剑桥大学王后学院的院士，以及神学和科学的研读者。
There's been quite a big tendency in the 20th century to do a retreat to some kind of subjective or existential understanding of Christianity. But Steiner is absolutely going in the opposite direction. For him, it is just an objective fact that the evolution of human consciousness was changed by Christ. I mean, take it or leave it. I mean, and even if no one had known about that, even if there had never been anyone of Christian faith, for Steiner, I think that transformation of human consciousness would still have happened as a result of the work of Christ.
波特恰克教堂，史黛纳在这个村庄待到8岁。从童年到终其一生，他都被形形色色的人所吸引，包括牧师。在他的自传中，史黛纳描述他的父亲为自由思想家。知识对史黛纳越来越重要，但他所注重的是一种科学与宗教、信仰与理性并不相互对立的知识。他有时被形容为无形事物的科学家。
I think the distinctive thing about Steiner's approach to that is to want to find some scientific approach to religious and spiritual questions. There are different ways of bringing science and religion into dialogue, but I think that's what's distinctive, to approach, I think he would say the spiritual rather than the religious, but to approach the spiritual in a scientific way. He clearly has exceptional powers. Because they're so unusual, it's hard to know quite how to characterize those, but he's clearly some kind of clairvoyant. And he's unusually disciplined and highly trained in the way he uses those clairvoyant powers. And he has such a serious sense of purpose to leave the world a better place as a result of his mission. And arising out of that, all this great outpouring of practical activity. And I don't know of anyone else who spans all those things, really, has the exceptional powers, is so disciplined with them, so purposeful and so practical. I think that's a unique contribution.
Why is Steiner not better known, do you think?
It's an interesting question why Steiner isn't better known. I think there are various reasons. There's something off-putting about his writings. I think that has to be said.
What style, you mean?
Yes. Style and content, I think. And also something off-putting about the society, the kind of following that he has sometimes built up around him, which can look rather too cult-like from the outside. Not at all what he wanted, I think, but it can look like that.
全球对史黛纳感兴趣的人日益增加。在印度南方城市海德拉巴举行的人智学学会亚太地区大会，吸引了数百人前来参加。人智学是史黛纳脱离神智学后为他的运动起的名字。这些人绝大多数会拒绝被称作宗教膜拜，因为这些教师、农夫、医生和治疗师不自由于史黛纳的思想和启发，力求将其化为自己的见解并发展之，以从史黛纳去世后近100年以来的教育、科学、医学和心理学新知识汲取养分。
I'm originally from the UK. I met anthroposophy 34 years ago in a school for handicapped children near Reading. It's now a Waldorf school. At that time it was a special school. Some severely disadvantaged children there. And I worked as the gardener. And my wife worked as the cook. And for me, meeting the work of Rudolf Steiner was like finding water in the desert.
全面向西方学习，但是片面地学了西方的科学技术。
Most of my teaching in Waldorf education has been in Australia. And in the last few years of still teaching in Australia, in the 90s, I already started to come to Asia during my holidays and made contact with various very grassroots initiatives beginning the Waldorf schools. And little by little this grew, and now I work full-time, really, and particularly now in China and Taiwan.
What is the response then to Steiner in that part of the world?
It's exploding. It's phenomenal what is happening in China at the moment. I would say the people who come to the training courses and seminars and the initiatives that have started in China, those people, I would say, are hungry. They're really hungry to find meaning in their lives. They're hungry to connect with the outside world. And they're deeply grateful. That is my experience, and this is what gives me energy.
The mainstream education in China is very, very tough, very, very competitive, and the children, they're forced to study from very young, from kindergarten back to 3 years old. And more and more parents realize this is not what they want. And actually, like the world of schools and kindergartens, most initiatives are parents.
在印度及世界各地，父母越来越担忧孩子承受过多压力。除了现代生活的压力外，孩子必须出类拔萃，成绩优秀，培养资格，通过考试，只为日后找到一份好工作。但很多人认为，孩子过早承受了这些压力。海德拉巴的舒洛加幼儿园注重一套十分简单、规律重复的创意游戏与说故事活动，甚至只是静静观察和思考。
As little children, they cannot differentiate between play and work. For adults, we know that there's a play time and a work time, but children, play is as important because it's all imitation, that they imitate whatever they see. And actually, if they're like, I'm cutting fruit, they could be, cutting an imaginary fruit there, but they're actually doing it. It could look as play for us, but for them, it's real work.
1919年，史代纳与斯图加特成立第一所华德福学校。他强调童年具备鲜明的阶段性，儿童不只需要成长，了解世界的运作方式，也需要时间和空间，让每个孩子带给世界的礼物和谐地展开。正如诗人华兹华斯所形容的，跟随灿烂的云朵，纵然我们身上或许背负着某些前世的包袱，未必总是光辉灿烂。华德福幼儿园朴实简单、从容不迫的气氛，吸引了全世界越来越多的家长。在纽约上州的山楂谷华德福学校，我接触到这种日益广泛的觉醒。被侵蚀的童年造就缺失的成人。
There's a story, I think it's from Zorba the Greek, about him holding a butterfly that's just come out of a cocoon and wanting to see it fly. So he tries to blow on the wings to dry the wings before their time, before they're really strengthened and ready. And the butterfly ends up crumbling and unable to really fly, and its time was not yet come for it. So we're giving children time.
史代纳从未造访美国，但他在生命的最后20年遍访欧洲各国，发表了6000场以上的演讲。除此之外，他还写书、创作剧本和冥想颂词。史代纳档案馆收藏了史代纳1925年去世前的相关著作，由沃尔特·库格勒负责管理。档案馆位于这栋建筑的地下室，瑞士歌德大殿草坪的对面。歌德大殿是史代纳所创立的人智学学会总部，原为木质建筑，由史代纳亲自设计，并与国际志愿者合作， 耗费8年时间建成，但在1922年年夜付之一炬。史代纳再度绘制设计图，这次材料采用水泥而非木头。但史代纳生前未曾亲眼见到建筑完工，他在接下来几年的时间游历欧洲，一边演讲一边撰述神秘学，例如因果缘分、前世今生及宇宙进化。此外，他也播撒种子，为人类生活各领域的复兴而给予指导，包括各类艺术。但史代纳不仅专注于分享他日益深刻的灵性经验，他还创造新的建筑与雕刻形式，启发了如康定斯基和约瑟夫·波伊斯等艺术家。尽管健康欠佳，他仍继续旅游。1923年，他来到威尔士北部。此时，他对一战后产生的政治、社会和经济问题感到担忧。
He feels that humanity is in a great battle, and he's trying to help, really trying to save evolution from the dead end.
Or one-sidedness.
One-sidedness is a dead end. If it's unbalanced, it will break, it will crash, and it will bring terrible suffering. Well, see, Steiner feels we have already been through terrible suffering. There is terrible suffering in the world, cruelty, people, starving. That's an unbalance. So he's very interested in economics and in the proper way for a government and a community to form in order to really to save people from starvation and also from meaningless work. Great concern. He's not a Marxist, but he drank from that cup. He knew that Marx's critique of capitalism has some profound truth to it. It's a cruel system. Totalitarianism is also cruel. We haven't found an uncruel system, but that's what he was looking for, where the economic, the political, and then the whole cultural sphere would work collaboratively in their respective spheres without anyone taking over the other. But in the West, but particularly in the United States, the economic, of course, is just far more powerful than the other spheres, controlling education, even religion. For him, this is a great concern.
经济学将目光导向银行业。罗伯特·麦克德莫特表达了和史代纳100年前同样的担忧，即经济领域过分扩张，比重过高，这点令许多人忧心忡忡。这天是荷商特里多斯银行在英国伦敦分行举办的客户日。与会的顾客和银行家一起用与众不同的方式与金钱工作，拥有更高的透明度、责任感和更清楚的觉知。彼得·布洛姆是特里多斯银行执行理事会主席。
I'm convinced that banks should look more at what is really needed in society and then make out of that a feasible business. And then you need some profit, of course. You cannot do without profit, but you don't start with profit. Profit is the result. And I think that was also something what relates strongly to what Steiner always said. Profit is not something you aim for. Profit is something what is a sign of a healthy operation. It's emerging from a healthy transaction. And that is a much better way of looking at profit than putting it there as a goal, as an objective, and make everything work for that goal. With Steiner, he always had the human being in the back of his mind when he was talking about economics, about medicine or whatever. And that is an important element what we can learn about, because most of the thinking now, we exclude the human being. It's about a system, and the human being should fit into the system. And what he did was saying, well, let's take each human being as a starting point, and let's design something around that, what can work to serve human beings. And that deeper principle, I think, is quite important. And you cannot achieve that by just copying what he has said or just repeat what he has said. I think that's the challenge, maybe not so much for him, but for us to work with what he has brought to us.
史代纳的工作经常是对各方问题和要求的回应，包括个人、专业团体、教师、农人、牧师、艺术家和医师。1921年4月，他在其瑞士基地多纳赫举办为期3周的讲座课程，这是他首次对人质医学进行详细系统性的介绍，并阐述胡寄生对癌症的疗效。这类集会的目的在于促进对人类的了解。史代纳认为，少了对人的认识，我们无法查明健康和疾病的真相。史代纳和荷兰医师伊达·维格曼密切合作，将他对健康和疾病的理解运用于实际治疗。然而，早在1912年，他就与第二任妻子玛丽·冯·西弗斯合作，配合他当时正在撰写的神秘剧，创造了一种新的律动艺术。它既是一种疗法，也是一种艺术形式，名为音语舞。
Sonne, du strahlend tragende, deines Lichtes Stoffgewalt, zaubert Leben aus der Erde, unermesslich reichen Tiefen.
Bravo! Diese haben wir nicht den rechten Fuß haben wir gemacht. Ja. We are working with speech and we are working with music, but in such a way that we try to be music and be speech. Be music is more understandable because you have ballet, they work with music, but they don't really go into the laws, if you can say that, of the music, the different elements of the music. But in tone eurythmy, you go into all the elements of music and you become them.
Ja, ganz richtig. Genau.
Rudolf Steiner calls it visible song. So that what is singing, what you hear in the music, that is what we are trying to express. And with speech, the same thing.
Die Weltenkräfte, sie verführen dich.
So the movements are very precise. You're not ad-libbing them.
No, not at all. They are really born out of the elements of music.
And speech.
And speech too. You have the vowels, you have the consonants. What we usually use when we speak, and we don't think about it, that it's possible also to express through movements this speech.
Herz, du Seelentragendes, deines Lichtes Geistgewalt.
Nur hier haben wir das Gleiche wie vorher, Seelentragende, nicht Tragende bis zu Ende laufen.
玛格丽莎·索尔斯塔是瑞士歌德大殿国际人质学总会音语舞舞团团长。 单凭音与舞或许无法拯救世界，歌德大殿的外形也或许无法迎合每个人的口味。然而，史代纳试图用它们唤醒人们，去觉知仿佛隐藏在表面世界背后的东西。音与舞探索音乐与语言的另一层面。对史代纳而言，它如关乎灵性或物质，天堂或人间二元对立，而是灵性与物质合一。世界只有一个，但远比纯粹物质思维的人所乐于承认的更复杂，层次更丰富。史代纳通过结合常年努力不懈的沉思冥想和开放的心胸，将他与生俱来的灵视力发展为灵性科学的感知力。每个人都具备这种能力，可运用这种观看的方式来超越感官印象和狭隘的理智。史代纳曾说，他的任务是唤醒人类灵性与宇宙灵性的连接。换句话说，如先人所言，人类实乃宏观宇宙的微观体现。如今，史代纳不再沉默孤单，然而他却为此付出代价。他是出头鸟，攻击自四面八方袭来。在接下来10年间至1925年，仅64岁即英年早逝的他，获得了非凡成就，也尝到悲剧。然而，尽管身心俱疲，疾病缠身，史代纳仍继续提醒我们，我们具有进化的潜力，我们在宇宙间并不孤单，而是依据神的形象所创造的。有的人信他，有的人不信，这是对他的挑战。现在，轮到我们了。